I'm so excited to have another grammar nerd on the podcast. Fellow educator Marty Brandt is here to talk about his book called Between the Commas. Marty, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It's great to be here.
Would you tell us about your context of where you're teaching right now, just to give us situated?
Yeah, I teach at Independence High School in San Jose, California. I've been teaching there for 30 years now. Sort of gave my youth to that place. And as you can see, all gray. And I went in to Independence thinking that I was going to, you know, make everybody's lives better right away with my enthusiasm and my passion for my subject matter, for my teaching, for my students. And really, I just kind of fell on my face for a couple years in a row. Just everything went wrong. Everything I tried to do was a complete disaster. And I really had to kind of pick myself up and dust myself off and start all over again, kind of every school year for the first several years. And I've gotten to the point now, however, where I just really, really love what I do. And I love working with these wonderful students who often get a bad rap, both as, for their generation. It's always the sort of a habit of the older generation to dismiss the younger generation and to wring our hands at the prospect of the future. And I don't believe that. I don't feel that way. I look at these kids and I think, one, they're a lot more decent and kind and loving to one another than my generation ever was. I mean, we were awful. So, and I also feel like they're underrated with regard to their linguistic prowess. And once I understood this, once I came to realize that they didn't need to be taught so much as they needed to be shown what they already have in them, and to be able to lead them in the right direction with that, then teaching there became an absolute joy. And so even though I'm kind of old and getting a little cranky, and I'm getting pretty close to retirement now, I just still feel very, very fortunate to be able to work with these kids at Independence High School. Independence, by the way, is this very large campus, and there's a sort of a persistent myth about it that it was originally intended as a junior college because it's so big and it occupies several acres. And that's not true. It's just one of those things that helps people make sense of its size. And originally, when I was first beginning there, it was about 4,000 to 4,400 students. And now our enrollment has gone down for various reasons over the last 10 years. And now it's about 2,800 students. And so, it's kind of an interesting place when you say 2,800 students is under enrolled. But the great majority of my students have at one time or another been classified as English language learners. Maybe not the great majority, but I would say maybe at least 50% to 60%. And so if I go through my rosters on the computer program that we use, the platform, there's a little flag that says, for various distinctions that each student will have. Some might be still classified as English learners. Others will be classified as English proficient after having taken various tests over the years. And whenever I go through that roster, I see those flags, and it's consistently in about the 60% range of kids who are either EL still or were once classified as such. And it's a immigrant community where I teach. Most of the students come from not necessarily them, but their parents, but many of them too will have come from various Pacific Rim countries. A lot of students from Vietnam, a lot of students from the Philippines. There's a sizable Latino population, and so it's a real linguistic mix. And to be thrown into that mix as a new teacher is it could be a recipe for disaster, because you might bring in all the wrong assumptions about language, about teaching, and about teaching language. And you can easily become some kind of grammar enforcer, pointing out all the errors, pulling your hair out in the face of all these errors. And yeah, and I have come to believe that there's a lot less reason for that kind of frustration than we often tell ourselves.
Well, Marty, just hearing you talk, I can just tell that you've given 30 years of love and commitment and investment to your school community, and your students are so lucky to have such a kind-hearted person um, teaching them as part of their career.
Thank you.
I think one thing you talked about was like instead of like the that grammar person, and you move towards like what kids can do, right? And you
Right.
talked about like the Gen Z population of like moving towards an asset-based perspective, seeing them in the best light, and that's
Yes.
informing your practice. So I'm like, whew, you are a gifted and wise teacher.
Hard. It was hard won. That whatever wisdom I've got,
Yes.
it came the hard way. But I think that might be one of the aspects of wisdom that doesn't necessarily go into the definition, is that you generally acquire it the hard way.
Right. Right. It's someone said, "How are you successful?" One word: experience. Okay. How do you get
Right.
experiences? One word: mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you've had 30 years there, and you've worked with lots of multilingual students, so which is really great for our audience. Would you share with us a story about just teaching? It doesn't have to be about multilingual students that has informed your practice to this day.
Well, one of the things that I needed to learn when I first started to teach was the fact that my students are, I don't want to say necessarily say better at language than I am, but I needed to give their linguistic prowess its due. A great number of them, um, well, they already speak whatever their original language was. And then they speak English, and they speak English as if they stepped off the set of Friends. They sound exactly like, the word native is kind of freighted, but they sound like native speakers of English.
Quite proficient.
Um, yeah. And then in addition to that, I had to learn that they're not just, you know, how can I put this? That actually, they've actually got multiple languages, many of them. So a student might speak Vietnamese, might speak some Cantonese, might speak some, and will speak English, and might be taking French or Spanish or German. And so what this shows me is it's a term that keeps coming up, is their linguistic prowess, that they are incredible users of language, that they acquired whole grammatical systems, um, more than one, by the time they were a few years old, without the help of a single worksheet, without the help of a single lesson on grammar. We have this innate hardwired ability to master grammatical systems. And I'm not sure what the research says about it, but I think it probably helps to acquire these early in life. But even if you don't acquire them early in life, once you're immersed in it, once you find yourself speaking this language frequently, daily with the other speakers of it, you learn it. You might learn it with a significant accent, or some things that make you sound as if you're not a native speaker. But I mean, what does that matter, right? And so really what I had to overcome was this notion that I was the master of the language, and that the students were going to to benefit from my expertise, when what I really had to really understand was that they are masters of language themselves, and that I had to find ways to bring that out of them. So early on, at one point, I talk about this in the book. One of the things I just sort of stumbled upon was the idea of sentence modeling, because a lot of their sentences were, very problematic, to say the least. And so I thought, well, I guess the biggest problem with student writing is not that it's incorrect; it's generally that it's kind of uninteresting. And the real problem with this is that the students themselves are not uninterested, are deeply interesting. They're fantastic. It's so much fun to talk with them and get their perspectives on things. And yet all of this personality that they bring into the classroom disappears the moment they put a pencil to paper. And so I thought to myself, well, when I read certain magazine articles, I'm always impressed with the writing of magazine articles, because they seem to just sort of lead you along. The sentences are just sort of easy on you, and they move you so easily from one thing to the next. And the example that I had was the opening line of John Krakauer's article in Outside Magazine that became Into Thin Air, which was his best-selling book about the 1996 Everest disaster. And the opening line in it goes, straddling the top of the world. So he begins the story with him at the top of Mount Everest. So it doesn't start with him in Kathmandu or leaving Seattle. It starts with him at the top, presumably already the climax of the story. Of course, it's not, it turns out. But so he begins with straddling the top of the world, 1 foot in Tibet and 1 in Nepal. I cleared the ice from my oxygen mask, hunched a shoulder against the wind, and stared absently at the vast sweep of earth below. And I thought to myself, why can't my students write a sentence like that? Why, when they write, is it just sort of simple declarative sentences, often punctuated incorrectly, like commas between these sentences and things like that? Why can't they do that? And that became the sort of my grail, my great quest, was just to encourage my students to try new things sentence wise. And so I broke that line up in the other subsequent sentences of that same paragraph. I broke it up into just grammatical chunks with space underneath each of them. And I had the students see if they could imitate it, make their own version of this sentence. So where he says straddling the top of the world, you could say something like standing in front of the refrigerator, 1 foot in Tibet and 1 in Nepal, my hand on the handle, and my eyes searching the shelves, and then it's just subject and 3 verbs. I cleared the ice from my oxygen, I found the chocolate sauce, reached in and threw it to my brother. It's something as simple as that. But I discovered there was some success, but I discovered that for my students, and I think for most people, most phrases look pretty much the same. They all look the same. And there were different kinds of things going on in that sentence. And so it took me a while to figure out what these things were myself, because I didn't know what they were any more than they did. The only advantage I had was that I could identify what they were doing. I understood in some kind of an implicit way what the features were of each of these things, and make my own version of it. And so, one of my students came up, and this was a pretty rough class, and he wrote something like, sitting on my bed, one hand holding a 40 and the other with a hand on the bong, the other one on my, on the bong. I took a deep hit, drank from the can and waited to get high, and so I looked at that and I said, I was just talking about how the students are very interesting, right? And here is a very interesting young man, you know, and so I had, on one hand, I wanted to say, you should say no to drugs, but on the other hand, I had to admit this was a damn good sentence. And so I said, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Go finish that up. So this success led to sort of a developing curiosity about using models like that, or modeling assignments like that, to help students understand what they can do at the sentence level. I think most successful writing, most writing that is memorable, that has power, it succeeds because of what happens at the sentence level. And we spend a lot of time in English classes talking about things like paragraphs and essays. And as I've said in the book, I've read lots and lots of essays that are perfectly well organized with all of the features and conventions that we English teachers so earnestly impose on them, but which still are not worth reading because of what happens at the sentence level. They're ultimately either uninteresting or, well, I guess that's really the main thing, is that they're not worth reading because there's nothing interesting happening. There's no real thinking going on. There's only this kind of miserable attempt to reproduce these things that we've required of them, and that takes all the joy out of it. And so I want them to be able to work with their sentences, think about their sentences. One of the other things that I've been thinking about is the fact that I think there's a real misunderstanding or a misconception about sentence work. And I've even heard it coming from my own district office. And it's this assumption that the sentence has been learned. The sentence has been taken care of sometime in elementary or middle school. And that's simply just not true. I want my students to think about their sentences. And when we say to them things like, reread your essay and see what you can do to make it better, what we really mean by that is, what's happening at the sentence level. That's kind of the implied instruction there. What's happening what can you do to make these sentences, swing, to use a musical term? It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. But if your students don't understand or haven't been prepared to look for certain features of the sentence, then that advice is really kind of useless, and I've discovered that to be the case too. You can tell your students, read your paper again before you turn it over or turn it in. And well, if they don't know what they're looking for, then what's the point of even saying that? So the sentence needs to be taught, is my argument. But it needs to be taught in a way that begins with what they know and shows them what they already know. Because a lot of these things they already use in conversation, they use it in their speech. And so it becomes a question of bringing that personality that shows up in their conversation into their writing.
Can you talk more about that? What do you mean by the kids already know it or they bring it?
Okay, so if you take a sentence like, let's see here. My brother, the biggest doofus I've ever met, told me that that my team was going to win, whatever. Something else. And it doesn't make any sense, but you see what I mean. So when students take an opportunity to interrupt that subject, my brother, with the verb, to talk a little smack about the brother, right? My brother, the biggest doofus ever. What they're doing is that's a noun phrase, a positive. Okay, there's a grammatical term for that particular addition, that particular phrase. And so, however, it doesn't necessarily occur to them to use it in their writing, even though they already make use of it in their speech. So I gave it to my teacher, who's a total, I gave it to my first period teacher, who's a total tyrant, you know. What they've just done there is they dropped a dime on the teacher, you know, or that's called the adjective clause. It's the, taking that who and using it to effectively describe the teacher after that word teacher. Okay, so these are things that they already make use of. And so it's important when we talk about grammar and grammar instruction to start with the fact that they already use these things, that it's a slightly different animal to be able to write them, because it takes a certain amount of, the issue of punctuation comes up, and the issue of, I guess what you'd call it in rhetorical terms is invention. If it doesn't occur to you to use it, then it's not going to be there. So a lot of times you can point to the students where it could go, or where it's lurking there, ready to be placed. And I call these latent free modifiers, these modifying additions. Oftentimes they're lurking right there in the student's errors. And instead of saying to the student, wrong, check, instead you say to them, ooh, this is so close to being a perfect smack talker. See me about that, and it becomes an opportunity for stimulating and encouraging growth, rather than some kind of punitive approach like, why did you do this to me? Why do you keep making these mistakes? We have to accept the mistakes as an important part of the learning process.
Well, I'm first of all, before I give my comment, I wanted to say that you're a really great podcast guest, because
Oh,
instead of having the host like try to pull and like pepper questions at you, you just
uh-huh.
go into your flow of conversation. I think there's only like 4 or 5 guests out of my 150 guests that have done that, and that's a
Really?
very rare skill. And Jeff Anderson did that. I
All
asked
right.
3 questions total,
Really?
and he just talked like the whole time. I was like, and I
I'll
even
have
said,
to meet him sometime.
"Oh, you two are on the same wavelength." I mean, and I was gonna say that you have such an affirming and assets based perspective. When I asked that question of like, tell me more about what that means, like it's already in the kids. It is in the kids already.
Right.
It's how they speak already. We're just trying to say like, you already speak like this lyrical way of speaking. Now bring it into the writing. And you also did a really great job. And I wrote down the words. He's an experienced teacher of multilinguals, because
Hmm.
your strategy of like taking the sentence, breaking it up to different parts, having providing a space below for each part, and then having students try to practice that. That's the writing
Right.
workshop. That's the
Hmm.
mini lesson. That's scaffolding, making language, making the process scaffolded for students. And I was like, wow, he's a really great teacher of effective teacher of MLs.
And that happened as a complete accident. I was just desperate for something to do that day with this really challenging class. And so I did that. And then later on, there's a lot of uncertainty with English teachers about whether you're doing it right, you know. And so many years later, I discovered that teaching writing is the great professional problem, at least for me. And that it's what I want to spend my career doing, is learning more about teaching writing. And it's a wonderful thing to drive your career and to feel like there's real growth happening for you and not just your students. And so once I made this discovery that teaching writing was the thing. Most English teachers, I think, hate teaching writing, by the way, because we're into literature, and the writing is where we feel most exposed or most anxious or most unhappy with our work and our students' work. But once I figured out that the writing was everything to me, I found a program in a master's degree program at San Francisco State University in composition. And I didn't even know that such a thing existed. I remember saying to my friend, Jonathan Lovell, who is a professor at San Jose State, saying to him, Jonathan, is there a program for a master's in English that focuses on the teaching of writing, because I didn't want a master's in literature. I didn't want at this point a seminar in Milton. You know, that wasn't going to help me with my students. I needed something that helped me become a better and more effective teacher of writing. Well, they didn't have anything at San Jose State, alas. And so I thought, okay, well, there's a dream that died. And then about a year later, I was looking through and I thought, I wonder if San Francisco State, which is only about 45 miles from my house, and it could be a reasonable commute. I thought, I wonder if they do that. And I looked it up, and sure enough, they had this master's in composition, which was aimed at teaching freshmen in college composition and first year comp, one of the great traditions of the American university, problematic tradition. And so I thought, well, that's close enough, you know. That's probably as good as you're going to get it, you know. And so I signed up for it, and I took this class called, the very first class I took. Well, it was the very first class. It was called Grammar and Rhetoric of the Sentence. And, you know, I guess it's indicative of the kind of weirdo I am, that when I saw that title, Grammar and Rhetoric of the Sentence, I went, oh, yes. Oh, I can hardly wait. Let me at it, you know. And so and it was a really hard class. And a lot of my classmates, cohort members who I really just adore, you know, wonderful people, they just hated it. And for various reasons. And I understand the hatred of such things. I understand where it comes from. But for me, I was like, you know, I respect the fact that you hate this class, but I could hardly wait to bring this back to my students, you know. And so one of the interesting things about it is that it was called Grammar and Rhetoric. Now, grammar is one of the most misunderstood words in the English language, because people will say grammar when they mean punctuation, or grammar when they mean spelling, or grammar when they refer to usage. Now, the grammar. But the real essence of grammar is syntax. It's the order of words such that it will make sense in a particular language. And it's why so that which is grammatical, for example, is, you know, why we say in English, we will say the big house, you know, and in Spanish, you would say the house big, la casa grande. And so that's grammar, you know, is the order of words. And the neat thing about this particular class was that it understood that that the order of words also applies to rhetoric. And so whereas grammar is the order of words for understanding, rhetoric is the ordering of words for effect. And so, for example, if you say that, you know, let's see here. I was not there for the company, but for, let's see, no, I was there for the company, not for the food. Okay. Hey, not a bad sentence. Okay. But if you say, I was there not for the company, but for the food, you've made a grammatical and rhetorical change with a particular effect in mind. And that effect in this case is to emphasize the final point that you've just made, not for this, but for that. And whatever comes in that last place in at least in English, I'm not sure what in other languages, will carry more effect. It's the last thing that the reader or the listener is going to take from that particular sentence. And so it's not just a grammatical shift, it's also a rhetorical shift. And so there's this wonderful place where grammar and rhetoric meet, and it is syntax, it is word placement. And so this is another thing for students to think about with regard to their sentences. Another layer of the great mystery, if you will, you know. And so once I took that class, I was off and running with my sentence stuff, because I discovered in that class that what I had done, this is to get back to that problem of English teachers thinking, oh, I don't know if I'm doing it right. That what I had done that day with those sentences, with that sentence modeling assignment from John Krakauer, had in fact a very long and respected place in language, in writing instruction. sentence modeling like that. And I read some of the very first things I read in that class were essays written for in support or to advocate that kind of instruction. I thought, oh, so I guess I was doing it right. It was just an accident. It was a shot in the dark, but I hit the target.
I think you just gave me a master class in grammar instruction. You explained what grammar is, and it's not just about mechanics,
Right,
right? It's not just about punctuation. It's
right,
really about sentence placement, oh, word placement, and for
right.
effect, right?
And phrase additions,
Afraid of it.
and where you place those phrase additions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're teaching kids what you're teaching kids that writing is an intentional act. It doesn't happen by
right,
accident.
right.
Message and comprehension, we create the effect that we want readers to have.
Right, and one of the things that students do, the really great challenge, I think, is the fact that students write accidentally, and I think there's a place for accidental. I love the accidents of thought. I love the accidents that we come across when we write, and we don't write with necessarily knowing what we're going to say. The beautiful thing about writing is that we often find out through our writing what we have to say, and so there is an accidental sort of component to it. The problem with my students is that they're not necessarily engaging in the level of thinking that I want them to, and they're just trying to get it done. And so instead of it being intentional and thinking about what they're saying as they're writing it and think about where it might lead them, they are instead just, like I said, a lot of them just it's such a source of anxiety and challenge to them that they just want to finish.
Yeah, I can see that. As you said that, I was thinking about students and their writing samples or the writings that they produce. The ones that create the most beautiful sentences, the most effective sentences, are the ones that are you could tell that there's intentionality
Right.
in the words they use, but the placement of the words and the order of the ideas in the sentence. Yeah, it's just. I guess the challenge is how do we make writing assignments that bring out that intentionality in students, right?
Right, right. And one of the things that I propose in the book is there's one of the issues I came up upon in my in that master's program was learning about sentence coherence and how sentences work together to create meaning. And actually, even before, no, it must not have been. I came up with this lovely idea. It's one of you'll have to forgive me, but I'm very proud of this insight, and it's probably not even original, but it was original to me. Yeah, I'm like Columbus discovering America, right? And it's but it was original to me, and I remember showing it to my friend Jonathan again, and he was the director of the San Jose Area Writing Project, and so we did a lot of things, a lot of work together, and I said to him, I wrote it down. Each sentence that we write contains within it some germ or seed which should sprout or blossom in the next sentence. And that is how we create coherence. And I even created a little model for it that I give to my students, and I have them paste in their composition books. Sometimes I create little composition booklets for them to use and I always have the model as part of it. And basically what it has is on one side, it's got the word sentence, meaning any sentence that you write. And then from that, several arrows leading to questions. And so the first question, the top arrow leads to the first question, which is basically, what do you mean? So if you say my room is a mess, the old show, not tell, what do you mean? What do you mean it's a mess? Show me what it means, what it looks like, And this is, I think, the sort of default setting for discourse, explaining what we mean. But I had made the mistake of thinking for many years that question was enough. But what happened with my students was that you can really only explain what you mean for a few sentences before you start spinning your wheels. And that's where you lead to the agonizing cycle of BS in writing. right? And so the students just start repeating themselves in other words and adding a lot of BS, and no wonder they hate writing if it's going to be like that. And so I realized that maybe there were other questions that they should be considering, so that when they got to the end of their rope with what do you mean, maybe it's time for the next question, which is can you provide an example? Time to move out of the theoretical and into the concrete, you know. And then one of my favorites is, what don't you mean? And that's the point that you see in lots of editorials and newspaper columns, where people will say things like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this, I am saying instead that. And so between these three questions, I've discovered a student can get from the top of a page to the bottom of a page in a comp book with very little BS. And then I've got some deeper questions on the lower half of those arrows, like can you define your terms? That's for a deeper kind of writing assignment, I think, something maybe a little bit more academic. What are the implications of what you're saying? And that kind of works really well for the end of what somebody's writing. And so questions like these, I've discovered, can just sort of help stimulate them, because one of the great problems that students face in their writing is, what do I say next? Where do I go? Where do I go in a way that'll still make sense? And so any one of these questions, in any particular order, can still lead to a coherent paragraph or page of discourse. And so this I found is a great way to avoid the problem that I had before, which was this notion that the students had to plan out their essay first, plan out what they're going to write, in some kind of a graphic organizer, and then convert it from graphic organizer status into presto, an essay. And that's not the way I ever wrote. And I love writing. I've always loved writing, but I think I benefited from, my granddad was a newspaper writer. My parents were English majors. So what seemed to me natural. It's another thing that made it difficult for me as a teacher. These things seemed to me to be so natural that it frustrated me when I saw my students struggle with them. And I made one of the great mistakes of teaching, which is to say, "Oh, come on, it's easy. How can you not get that?" Because I'd get irritated with it, and I'm frustrated with my own failure. And that's what it really was frustration with my own inability to teach them effectively. And once I understood that it wasn't easy, it wasn't natural, it wasn't just the cakewalk that I thought it was, then I was in a position to treat my students more fairly, more humanely.
I feel like this is like teaching therapy for me. As a because sometimes I'll say, "Oh, this should be easy." I'm like, "Ooh,"
Right.
but I really like the strategy that you just shared. Instead of telling kids like go write, you have guiding questions for the students,
Right.
right? And
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
right, and they're the guiding questions, and they're not. So when I write my guiding questions, they're very content specific. For example, like what is globalization? Give me an example of globalization from the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I love how you're talking about it in a different way. You're saying like, let's not be specific in the content. Let's be general in this way, and so the
Mm-hmm.
kids can explore writing, because then what you're doing is you're developing a love of writing, but you're also developing independence in students,
Right.
right? In
Right.
this way.
Yeah, it's an attempt to restore their agency, which has been taken away by overly applied scaffolding. You know, and I know the appeal of scaffolding. Because if you have a kid, you have students doing things like filling out a a, a graphic organizer to sort of chart out their paragraph. I mean, that's a whole hour where they're working together, and they're it's something they feel they can do. It's often something they can do better than the final thing that you want them to do. That is the essay part. And so, yeah, you find it can be really, really tempting to to overuse those kinds of things because it provides you with the illusion sometimes it's an illusion that real writing is happening, or the kind of thinking that you want in writing is happening, but it's not I don't think it's at the same level of thinking. When we're really thinking and writing, we are asking ourselves these questions. We're aware of the audience at the other end. And we're willing to ask ourselves tough questions that lead to things to moves like, I'm not saying this, I'm saying that. An awareness, for example, that people might be misunderstanding what you're saying and that you need to clarify and sharpen your message a little bit. And I find that when students do that, their writing suddenly takes on a greatly improved quality. It becomes something that I enjoy reading. And that's another thing, is that, grading papers is the worst thing about teaching English. And it's, how many precious hours of my life have I wasted writing things like awk, for awkward, in the margin of some student essay, and how many weekends did I give up for that kind of thing? And I've come now to the conclusion that it's just better to read their writing. Read it as you would any writer. Put the pen down when you read it, and only pick it up when you want to point out something that they've done really well. And if you feel the need to point out an error, do it in a way that promotes their growth. Say to them, "Oh, this is close. This is you're almost there. This is the tail of a comma from being a perfect right branching smack talker." And so I there's a guy named Joseph Williams who wrote this really great essay called "The Phenomenology of Error," and in it he argued that one of the things about error is that we are seeking it. When we read essays, we're often in search of the errors. But when we read the writing of real writers, we're not searching for their errors at all, even though they might be there. And he's intentionally placed almost, I forget how many, but it was more than 50. And it might have been, yes, I forget, but he placed dozens of minor errors in his own essay. And he asked at the end, he made the confession at the end that he put these there, and did anybody notice? And the answer was, for most people, no, because we give to somebody like him the credit of the benefit of the doubt, whereas we give to our students, this expectation. Oh yeah, here we go. I'm going to get out old red now, and I'm going to straighten this kid out. So, but if we read our students' work like we want them to approach their work, if we want them to approach their work as writers, not as supplicants, not as people who have had all of their agency removed from them and don't know what to do or what to say next. If that's a quality that we want from them as writers, then I think it's only fair that we read them as writers, and not necessarily to find their errors, but to see what they have to say and whether they can make me think about this issue that we're writing about in a new way that is a result of their perspective as individuals.
I like your perspective. You're saying, like, let's shift from error finding and error correcting
Yeah.
to attempt celebrating.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Attempt celebrating. I love it.
I also wrote down what you said. You said instead of prompt completing, well, this is my synopsis of it. Instead of having students uh, complete prompts, you're shifting to crafting a message.
Mm-hmm.
And then when students are crafting a message, it's not about completing a prompt or completing uh, answering bullet points that you've placed. It's about how can we intentionally craft a message that gets the point across the most beautifully and effectively as possible.
Right. Right. And they've got to be free to explore. And that's one of the problems. That's one of the limitations, I think, of the graphic organizer approach, is that it kind of cuts off exploration. It cuts off inquiry. Sometimes a writer does need to digress. And oftentimes these digressions amount to the most pleasurable reading in the whole piece. Uh, but yeah, and the students need to have the ability or the freedom to be able to do that, and then be able to come back to the point that that the digression was meant to address.
Well, I'm gonna send all my kids over to you for English instruction. They would have a
I'll come out to Bang. You're in Bangkok?
yeah,
Yeah, I'll
yeah,
come out there.
yeah. Come on back anytime. Um, let's end the podcast with this. I just before I go to my last question, which is a metaphor, let's answer this one last question. Why is grammar in so instruction? Like, why write a book about grammar?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of disappointed in myself for having done that. I thought I thought I might have a better book in me than something on grammar. you know, it's like a mystery novel with lots of sex and violence or something. But instead, yeah, I wrote a book on grammar. Um, I just got to a point where grammar became fascinating, not odious. Or I could put this in a not but form. I discovered that grammar is not odious, but fascinating. See, there's my grammatical and rhetorical shift there. Um, and one of the things that got me thinking about it also is my nephew and my nieces are multilingual. My brother-in-law Gustavo is from Guatemala, and my sister, of course, is from California, and they have these lovely children, and I'm so jealous of these kids because they're already smarter than me. They've got two languages already, and they speak Spanish, perfect Spanish to Papa and perfect English to their mother, and it just goes to show, how hardwired we are for grammatical systems. And it deserves more. It just, I guess, yeah, that's maybe a good way of putting it. Is that, I began my answer, Tan, by apologizing for being interested in grammar, but it deserves better. That might be the real answer. It deserves better than what we've reduced it to. We've reduced it to things, horrible things like sentence diagramming, which is, I can see sentence diagramming being fun, a fun kind of thing to do, like Sudoku, or like some kind of puzzle that you do in the newspaper,
Wordle.
but yeah, exactly. But it's not the basis for language instruction. It's not the basis for writing instruction. You're not going to become a better writer by doing things like that. They're not going to become better writers by circling adjectives in worksheets, or putting the commas in pre-slugged sentences, that don't have punctuation. This kind of thing is what grammar has been reduced to. But I think that if we can focus on this issue of grammar and rhetoric, and how the two depend on one another, how they overlap, then we can raise grammar from the ashes, so to speak, and make it the glorious phoenix that it is. So
I think when I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, I get what he's saying. It's they deserve better. You said they deserve better, and I finished the sentence
students
because
deserve better.
yeah, students
Yeah,
deserve better.
definitely.
Grammar deserves better because students'
Mhm.
messages deserve an audience.
And the students deserve respect for their linguistic abilities.
Right, right.
And if we begin with an approach that acknowledges that first and foremost, these kids are, my nieces and nephew are better at grammar than I am. Not that they can, write a book like Between the Commas, but that they have this ability, and and I see it whenever I visit them, which is as often as possible. So um, yeah, it's very much like that. We need to give our students their due,
Right.
um, and that they are skillful users of language. Often more skillful. I mean, when we speak about multilingual students,
Right.
they're more skillful than I am. I have English, and I have 1 year of college Spanish. I have 2 years of high school German. I can go to those countries and read the signs. I can order. I can order something. I can some pretty basic conversation. Although in Germany, if I go there, they'll just speak English to me. But um, I wish that I could be as multilingual as my students are. And so I come to them, I approach them as, I guess I've reversed roles. I'm the supplicant. You know, they don't have to, make obeisance to me as some kind of grammar expert. They already are the grammar experts, and I want to start with that as the that's my starting point. That's my departure point.
Well, the starting point of a great teacher, a multilingual teacher, is the mindset. And you already have an
Yeah.
assets based mindset around students. And we see that in this conversation and in your book as well. So, Marty, let's end with this. I'm going to give you like a grammar structure here. It's called traffic light teaching. What should
It's called
teachers?
what?
It's called traffic light teaching.
Okay.
It's red light. What should teachers stop doing? Yellow light. What should teachers continue doing? And green light. What should teachers start doing in terms of their instruction with grammar?
Okay, so red light we've already discussed. We need to stop the what qualifies as traditional grammar instruction. It doesn't do anything to help make students better writers or users of the language. What was the yellow one again?
Continue doing.
Oh, to continue. Yeah, proceed with caution, right? Well, continue assigning writing. Um, have them write as much as possible. And when you do it, um, you know, don't worry about the errors so much. Don't sweat the errors so much. There's this idea that, but how will they learn? They're going to learn, but they're going to learn in their interactions with you, if they are positive ones. So be as positive, proceed with caution, and be as positive as possible with what you're seeing. Um, and be loath to ever point out something just as a mistake. Avoid that as much as you can. And for green, now
Start
green
doing.
was start doing.
Yes.
Yeah, start focusing on sentence development. Start focusing on and having them find ways to extend their sentences rather than limit them. One of the things that often happens in so-called remedial courses, and also in uh, courses for second language, third language students, is this notion that the sentences need to be shorter to avoid error. Um, and I don't think that's doing justice. So I say it's not doing them justice. I say go ahead and let them write, let them make mistakes, and talk about those mistakes in a way that celebrates what they're trying to do. And talk about their mistakes in a way that promotes their growth, so that they become interested in becoming more adept at this kind of thing, instead of retreating in fear, which is what the usual sort of grammar enforcement model causes.
Well, Marty, oh my goodness, how did an hour go by?
Hasn't been an hour?
Yeah.
Wow.
uh, Somehow, along your 30 years of teaching, working at Independence, you have become and also a very effective teacher of multilingual.
Thank you.
Every time as I'm hearing you talk, I'm like, ooh, yeah, he gets it. He gets our kids, and they're lucky to have you. And we're so fortunate that you spent this time sharing with us. Thank you,
I
Marty.
really appreciate that. Thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun.
It has really been a lot of fun.